days, there was an experiment. It was demonstrative evidence that the defense was trying to present, and it was about the stability or instability of the boat that Scott had taken to the marina. And there was an experiment that the defense we'd done, and showing that we had someone who had the weight, Scott's weight, and with a doll that was the same size and weight as Lacey, and he tried to throw it off of the boat with all the weights, and the boat actually capsized. So it just was not possible in that small boat. But unfortunately, the judge would not allow the defense to bring that in. We were not allowed to bring that in. And the worst part of it was the judge had not allowed this to come in, but the prosecution during their closing arguments had raised that argument, saying, oh, see, well, the defense didn't even bring you evidence, didn't even show you anything to prove that that boat was unstable. And that was truly, I mean, talk about unfairness, an unfair trial for the prosecution to bring that up, knowing that the judge hadn't allowed that demonstrative evidence in was inexcusable. And that's another issue that's been raised in the appeal. There are many, many issues raised in the appeal.
And there's been at least 6 other appeals, and one of those appeals was that there were missteps by Scott Peterson's lead attorney, Mark Garagos, and that team, and that you were a part of that team. So that was one of the many various appeals since the conviction back in 2004, correct?
That's my understanding.
And then as far as some of the other issues, the dog handling. So the scent that the dog handler had going down to the marina, my understanding is that there was a break in the chain of the word I'm trying to look at, there was a break in that chain where the dog handler did not follow the correct protocol and making sure that the dog was following the correct scent.
I can just say one thing. I remember during the trial and during the questioning of that expert, one of the defense counsel, Pat Harris at the time, he did the questioning, and one thing that he said sticks to my mind until today, and that was the dog was basically following and going all over the place, just like Paris Hilton at the time would be hitting up different bars in one night. That's how unreliable that was, but it did come in over defense objection.
And I know that there was also some issues in regards to the dog being misled based on a scent that was from the home back in Modesto. So that was one of the issues. Also in regards to some of the jurors, as you were saying, that there were some jurors that were switched out and some jurors that were allowed to stay, even though they had admitted that they actually went to the site to kind of see for themselves, which they were not supposed to do.
Right. I mean, there were a lot of different issues with the jurors. Clearly, one of the issues that really comes to mind, and it's with me, it bothered me then, and it's with me today, is that I really didn't think these jurors truly took into consideration what the defense was presenting. I think these jurors had come in to this trial with their minds, most of them at least, with their minds made up. They'd made up their minds. They'd been following the media coverage of it, and just were full of that hatred, that palpable hatred that people had at the time for Scott, and they'd made up their mind. It didn't matter what the defense did, what the defense presented. The bottom line was they were there basically for the ride, and the decision was made from day one, from the moment, or even before they were selected. There are plenty of what we call stealth jurors on that jury that during the questioning were discovered. I mean, these were people who, many of them pretended to be fair jurors, and they claimed that they were going to be impartial, but in reality they were not. Not in a case like this, where I would say at best it was circumstantial. I believed in Scott's innocence from day one, and I still believe it. And had that jury been following this case closely and had really taken into consideration what was being presented and what the evidence in the case was, they would have never convicted Scott.
Do you think that it was an issue because Scott had the affair? And do you think that they leaned into that, thinking that this was a man that just didn't want to be married, didn't want to be a father?
Well, I mean, he was demonized for that affair. But I mean, if we think about it, every man or woman who's had an affair and whose spouse happens to, get killed or disappear, does that automatically mean that that person did that? I mean, it just was a pure coincidence. We know a lot of people have affairs and their spouses do not disappear and nothing happens to them. This was a very short affair. He'd only seen her a few times. It was a handful of times. And the idea that a man who was in love with his wife would have killed his wife for a woman who he just met and had only seen a few times is ludicrous. But again, it was just another way to demonize him. It didn't help him. And people believed what they wanted to believe. And that was one more reason to hate him and to believe that he was capable of doing this. Basically, the idea was if he's capable of having an affair, then he's capable of murder.
And then what about as far as, I mean, his sister has come out, Scott Peterson has come out and said that she believes that her brother should have a retrial and that the evidence was just never there, kind of what you are saying as far as diving into the documents and that very lengthy appeal that is in before the California Supreme Court. Do you back up what she has said and has been very vocal about that?
Agreed. I would hope that the Court of Appeal would do the Supreme Court would do the right thing and he gets a fair retrial.
And why do you believe this time around, when we've talked about that there has been, 6 other appeals that I was able to find, why now? What is key this time around? Do you think that this might be the time where the Supreme Court would grant this appeal?
I think there's very strong arguments in the appeal, and there's plenty there for the Supreme Court to do the right thing and to grant the appeal in this case and overturn the conviction, in other words, and give him a retrial. We discussed some of the points that they've raised, and I mean, you look back at the evidence, and in reality, one of the best things that they have in the appeal, and I was reading it recently again, is that the prosecution did not present any evidence of really, truly how this happened, when it happened, where it happened. There was no forensic evidence to back up any of the arguments that they made. There was zero evidence in the house. There was zero evidence in his car. There was zero evidence in the warehouse. Everything showed that really there was nothing to back up that theory, the so-called theory that the prosecution had, but he was convicted. Again, I think the conviction was pretty much, I would say it's because of the media frenzy, the almost unrealistic interest that people had, fanatical interest that people had in the case, and the hatred they had of him. They just saw him as this man who had an affair when he had this beautiful wife who was pregnant, and they demonized him, and they could only see every little minor thing that he would do. They would, everything would be glorified, and it just would just feed into the hatred some more.
I reached out to the current district attorney there in Stanislaus County, and she was actually very involved in the actual prosecution during the trial when it was going on there in San Mateo County. Now, I remember some of the evidence that was presented. There was the tide charts, there was the vehicle, there was some witnesses that said that they saw Scott leave with someone. Is that also part of the appeal? Because I know some of those witnesses were not actually put back on the stand for cross-examination.
I'm not sure which witnesses you're referring to. But I mean, some of the grounds of the appeal that I mentioned are, to me, they're the most important ones. There were some witnesses who had seen a burglary across the street. There were witnesses who had seen, obviously, Lacey walk her dog after Scott had left. Again, I'm not sure which witnesses you're referring to.
There was some,
but overall, there was no scientific or forensic evidence to connect Scott to a murder in this case. Quite the opposite. Go ahead.
I just know that there were, at the time, I remember some neighbors saying that they saw Scott drive away in his vehicle on Christmas Eve, and some other comments made by people in the area and then people there at the marina where her body was later discovered, or the torso of her body was discovered. So again, I've reached out to the Stanislaus district attorney, the current district attorney, who was one of the prosecutors on the case that interviewed the detective, one of the lead detectives on the case. So is there anything else you think that is important as this case goes forward on June 2nd before the California Supreme Court about why you think that this time, that this appeal that is 470 pages, that Scott Peterson deserves a new trial?
I think the time has come that a lot of people now believe, and we've got the right setting and context for him to come out. A lot of people now believe that Scott is innocent. People's minds have changed. A lot of things have been discovered. There have been documentaries that have shed better light onto the case and have truly given the public the correct information on what happened, what was the evidence, and I just think it's the right atmosphere, it's the right time, and the arguments are there and the grounds are there for this conviction to be overturned and for this man to finally have his day in court, not just any day, but a fair trial.
Well, Lara, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to circling back when we hear more about what the court decides.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
My pleasure.